Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Paul Lee. Paul is the Vice President of the non-governmental, non-profit organization Divided Families USA. Now, this organization advocates for a formal mechanism, something in law, an institution, by which Americans of Korean descent can reunite with their direct relatives inside North Korea. These divided families include those Koreans who, during Japanese occupation, moved into Manchuria to avoid being drafted into the Japanese army. A second group involves those individuals who became prisoners of war during the Korean conflict. And similarly, there are those who were taken into North Korea during the Korean War as civilian labor and civilian expertise. But the largest group in all this are those Koreans who fled south from North Korean territory in order to avoid being conscripted into the North Korean army or to simply avoid the coming governance of their towns and cities by the North Korean authorities. And this is where Divided Families USA comes to the fore. There are formal mechanisms for South Korean and North Korean family unifications, and there has been a number of these over the years, but no such mechanism exists for Korean Americans. Such families have often been forced to resort to making their own way to North Korea, paying brokers, paying bribes, and trying to rely on the information that they receive. Such routes occasionally have their success, but often these families find themselves fleeced and no further forward in their search for their family members inside North Korea. Hence the need for a governmental connection, a solid, permanent solution for families to get in contact with each other. And this is pressing. As you may have grasped from those categories which I mentioned just before, these divided family members with direct family links inside North Korea are now in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. And to put things incredibly bluntly, in the next decade or so, they might all be gone. So Divided Families USA reaches out to local, state, and federal government and has had some success. The commitment to family reunification is one of those issues that people instinctively side with. But the challenge comes with the implementation, the institutionalization of a formal mechanism, which of course is held up dramatically by the political situation and the tension between North Korea, America, and in many ways the outside world. But through all these difficulties, there are ways through. And as Paul Lee will show, there is hope. New technology can help facilitate these reunions. And with a fast-moving and in some cases seemingly impulsive political climate at the moment, the chances for an agreement over family unification, just as there was recently with the return of the remains of US soldiers, can, if the right pressure is placed, and if politicians begin to raise this issue to the level of some other issues out there in the climate today, then there is no reason why there wouldn't be a fast and swift solution to this problem. It doesn't hinge upon a peace regime or denuclearization. Now, throughout this podcast, I touched on a series of other related issues that Paul Lee has researched himself, and that in many ways relate back to the issue of divided families. We talked through the challenges of North Korean defectors integrating and assimilating into South Korean society, the challenges that many have inside China, immediately across the border, and the fascinating phenomena of Korean enclaves inside Japan. But this is all done with a look towards the future and a look towards the work of Divided Families USA. And through all the difficulties facing this issue and all the challenges involved in producing a suitable outcome, this is an important look inside an incredibly valuable organization and an insight into the humanitarian trauma that many Koreans feel through the division and their perpetual links to North Korea and the ongoing crisis that hovers over the peninsula. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below. On that, and without any further delay, this is Paul Lee. Paul Lee, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Hi, Jed. It's really an honor to be here.
So today we're going to be talking through a lot of issues about divided families and defectors and a lot of, I suppose, complex and in some ways emotional topics. But first, I might get you to introduce yourself and the organization that you work for. You are Vice President of Divided Families USA, because what we talk about is going to come through that scope a lot today. So let's start there.
Yeah, great. So my name is Paul Cuman Lee. I'm a 1.5 generation Korean American immigrant, And as Jed just stated, I'm the vice president of Divided Families USA, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, completely volunteer-run organization that seeks to raise awareness about this urgent human issue of separated families of American citizens of Korean descent who wish to be reunited with their families in North Korea. So a little bit of history about this issue. I'm sure the listeners of the show are somewhat familiar with the scenes of inter-Korean family reunions, which have happened over 20 times, most recently this past August. But since the Korean War, which was when the majority of families were separated, but if you actually look at the history of family reunions, there are four main phases or four main sections of history, four groups of people from which most of these separated families, especially in the United States, came from. The first was during the colonial period of Japanese occupation of the Korean Peninsula. So this is when a lot of young men and women as well left the Korean Peninsula, went to especially northeast China, Manchuria, and joined the Korean guerrillas and were in forced labor camps. And by the end of the war, were separated from their family members. The second group, this is where the majority of the divided families came from, was during the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, the armistice. And if you've seen this famous South Korean movie, 국제시장, or Ode to My Father, I think is the English title, you see during the war, for example, during the Hungnam Chosu or Hungnam evacuation, there were so many different refugees, and the war was going back and forth, and people were evacuating their towns so frequently that a lot of families were separated. My personal ties to this issue come from the fact that my own grandfather was separated from his older brother, whom he was very close to. Although they were based in the southern part of the peninsula at the time, I remember my grandfather telling me that one day North Korean troops came and just took his older brother basically as a prisoner of war and forcibly conscripted into the North Korean army. And the third and the fourth groups, I know very little about personally, but based on the history that I've read, the third group were the Korean War prisoner of wars, who eventually escaped from North Korea, or those who remained in North Korea. And the final group were South Korean civilians, mostly intellectuals and doctors, engineers, scientists, those sorts, who were forcibly taken to North Korea as well. So that's just a broad layout.
That's actually quite helpful. That's great. So to give us a broad view there, that's a good starting point there. And I'm glad you mentioned the Hungnam evacuation. I had Ned Forney on the podcast a couple of weeks ago who talked through this.
Yeah.
And of course, it's very important because in some ways, in the current president of South Korea, his father, his family were part of that evacuation themselves. So
right.
From that grounding there, from that place of where we're coming from, what does your organization do? So give me some of the actual specifics on the ground. So of course, you're US. Do you operate in South Korea? Do you operate in North Korea? Do you do anything outreach there, or is it a government outreach project? Give us a broader look at the organization itself.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. So what we've been doing, what I've been doing the past few years I've been involved with this organization is, I would say our most important role is to be a liaison between the U.S. government, for example, the Korea desk at the State Department, and international organizations like the Red Cross, and our constituents, or sometimes even our own family members, who I'll refer to as these divided family members. Now, these are American citizens. Most of them are over the age of 70. Most of them are in their 80s, actually, who immigrated to the United States and ended up in the United States all over the country. And what we do is we maintain an active registry, and on this list of people, we try to keep in active contact with them. Update. I actually just got off the phone with an elderly man who lives in Centerville, Maryland, who I'm seeing tomorrow. But the people on this list, we update them about what's going on, if there's any, because what they want, for example, Mr. Min was separated from his cousin and from his uncle, who he's been yearning to see for the past several decades. So what we do is we try to be a liaison between the two groups, have their contact information, have as much information about their separated family members as possible, so that we're trying to prepare for, in the case that there's a green light from both the U.S., the DPRK governments, and the Red Cross, so that a U.S. DPRK reunion program can be facilitated, we can help make that happen as Divided Families USA.
Now that's a very important point there, because there are and there have been some formal channels for unification between family members between South and North Korea. But my understanding, though, there have been some interaction between American families and North Korea. There is no formal channel for this between America and North Korea. Is this correct?
Yes, that's correct. And if you put yourself in these divided family members' shoes, you would do anything. I would do anything to see my mother, my son, my sibling. So you have several instances of people on our registry, and also people that I've met, for example, in the Bay Area in California, who have gone through, non-official means, through brokers in China or through different agents in North Korea. And the reason that Divided Families USA, our organization, does not promote or support this kind of method is that in the past it's proven to be very unreliable, and the credibility of these brokers often ends up being so that these elderly people, who some of whom don't really have much money to begin with, are forced to pay a lump sum just to go, and they have no way to confirm whether it's really the family member they're looking for or not. So what our organization is pushing for is government-sanctioned, most importantly, safe reunions for these divided family members to be able to see their loved ones again.
And you mentioned earlier on, and this is one of the important points in this, and why it's such a humanitarian emergency in many ways. This is a really pressing issue. You mentioned most people that you deal with are in their 70s or 80s by virtue of when these family divisions occurred. So to put it quite bluntly, there's a bit of a tragic way to say it, many of these people are dying off, aren't they? This is an issue which, if it's not dealt with in the next decade or so, there will be not much of an issue to deal with.
Yeah, I think even a decade is pushing it, and that's part of the reason that I became so passionate about this issue. I cared about North Korean issues, about unification for a long time since growing up, but it was really only after my grandfather passed away a few years ago that I realized, this isn't just an issue. There are many other issues about North Korea, such as the human rights issue, the nuclear issue, that are very, very important. And I'm a strong proponent of prioritizing those issues. But this issue of separated families is something that I think is the most time-sensitive issue. And if you just look at the statistics on the South Korean side, which the Ministry of Unification in South Korea, I think, provides the best statistics. And just based on the number of divided family members in South Korea who have registered for this reunion program, there have more than half of these family members have passed. 57% of the, I think it's around 130,000 South Koreans who have registered to participate in these family reunion programs have passed away. So a majority of them have passed away, and a majority of them are in their 80s and 90s. So just to, and in the United States, we have less reliable data, but in 2000, according to census data, there were the most reliable source says that there were 100,000 American citizens who had direct relatives in North Korea. What we've seen in 2015, the number that most credible news sources have been using is no more than 3,000. And if you look at the people on our registry and the people we keep up with, I would say the number is going down every single day, to be honest.
So let's talk a little about some of the outreach that you get into here. So as you mentioned, there is this way in which many people can take it in their own hands, which you don't recommend. But what you're looking for is a government-sponsored or a government-organized link between the two countries. So there have been some developments in this area over the years. I've seen some resolutions passed through the Californian Senate, the California government, and I suppose there's been over the years some bills passed in the federal government as well, under the Bush and Obama administrations. But in many ways, these are not sufficient in as far as they are commitments to securing such access between these families, but there's no formal mechanism being discussed.
Yes, that's correct. And Divided Families USA has also been pushing on the legislative front in political advocacy. I would say what we thought was perhaps a great milestone in this regard was in the resolution that Congresswoman Karen Bass introduced as well this past year, but also in 2015, Congressman Charles Rangel from New York introduced House Concurrent Resolution 40, which, as you said, the language, both the language and the actual binding power of the resolution is not very strong. But what it did is it encouraged North Korea to allow American citizens, so Americans of Korean descent, to meet with their family members from North Korea, and calls on the DPRK to take steps to build goodwill that's conducive to peace on the Korean Peninsula.
So you mentioned earlier there the movie Ode to My Family, Ode to My Father, and I only bring this up in regard.
Yeah, it's a tearjerker.
Yeah, it really is. And one of those really teary moments is when he reunites with his sister, and he reunites with her. It's not a physical I don't want to give too much of this, but it's done via. It's a virtual introduction. It's done by TV screens. It's done over the internet. It's done by phone lines. So. Let's talk through some of the challenges here. So when you talk about reunification of family members, I assume you're talking about physical introductions, but also virtual introductions, which may be a lot more palatable and a lot more easy to get through in regard to both the North Korean and American governments.
Yes, that's true. And if you actually look at the people on our registry, the physical condition of the divided family members, both in South Korea and in the United States, while they say that they would want to travel to North Korea, and hypothetically, if we assume that that's possible, and the State Department grants exemptions to the travel ban to allow them to travel to North Korea, I think it would be very, very difficult for them to actually make that trip, just because of how frail they become and for their health. And many of them, what they really want, both with these technological reunions of video or letters or face-to-face reunions, is some kind of closure to this traumatic experience that they've had of being separated from their loved ones. So an example of what we've been trying to do is the chairman of Divided Families USA, Dr. Jason Ahn. He directed a documentary, the Divided Families documentary, where he went around the United States interviewing various divided family members, these elderly Korean Americans, so that they could speak up and voice a little bit of how they felt. And although probably none of their North Korean family members actually saw this documentary, I think it's a great way for them to find some kind of closure to this pain.
And if that is an easy way or an easier way into facilitating reunification or family connection, I can't even begin to fathom just how many complications, how many challenges your organization must be coming to in this regard. So talk us through some of the deep challenges that you're encountering here. Are they all political? Are they all to do with the difficulties between dealing with American and North Korean governments and that hostile situation there? Or do you encounter more and more smaller technical difficulties on the ground?
Yeah, well, first of all, just why technological reunions aren't that easy is, as you can see from the Singapore summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, a lot of this, for example, the prisoner of war remains issue, the repatriation issue, how do I put this? A lot of this is, at least for President Trump and for Kim Jong-un, it's for the publicity and for the media attention. So, and this was quite clear from the inter-Korean family reunions. It was on every single major newspaper and TV headline, right? As you see, these tearful reunions are very emotional, and many people from all over the world actually pay attention to them. So I would say these technological reunions, these, video or letters, I don't think they're attractive in that kind of policy-making point of view. Now, another difficulty, which I'll mention is, so inter-Korean reunions have happened, face-to-face inter-Korean reunions have happened over 20 times, and American citizens have, to this date, never been allowed to participate. Now, I would say there are various reasons for this, but I've personally talked about this issue of allowing American citizens to participate in these inter-Korean reunions, or at least apply for the opportunity to be able to do so. But from the South Korean point of view, it's very much, and as well as from the North Korean point of view, they've maintained that it's something that should be resolved in a bilateral level between the United States and North Korea. And although I see it a little differently, what the government see it as is a bit of a tit-for-tat, quid pro quo kind of issue of where, because there hasn't been any progress on the nuclear issue or denuclearization, humanitarian issues, even something so nonpartisan and so what I see as obvious as family reunions can't be tackled first.
So let's broaden this out slightly, and of course we will come back in and narrow this down again into this context. But let's talk about the defector community and these early divided families. So, for many people listening, when they think about the idea of a North Korean family being divided, or anyone from North Korea no longer living in North Korea, the assumption is that they would live in South Korea. And I suppose one of the first questions that we should bring up and introduce is, why is America such an attractive destination for these families? Because there is a large population, there is a large community, or at least there were a very large community inside America. So why is it that these people are making their way to America rather than settling in what would be in many ways, the natural choice of South Korea?
Well, I do have to say, out of the statistics that we have about North Korean defectors, people who've escaped from North Korea, the majority of them, the largest number, over 30,000, do choose to resettle and remain in South Korea. But I agree with you that many of them end up going to a third country even after they first settle in South Korea. Or one of my close friends, actually, he went directly to the United States from Southeast Asia. And I would say, I don't claim to, I'd say one major precaution about making these blanket claims about North Korean defectors is that what I've discovered is that it's such a diverse community, even among the small number of people I've met. But I would say what's really challenging from the people I've talked to is just the difficulties integrating into South Korean society. Of course, economically, a lot of them, just based on their education and just based on the different political system in North Korea, it's difficult to them because they don't have a lot of the skills or the know-how of adjusting to this super technology-based, fast-paced capitalist society in South Korea. But also culturally, I think a lot of them are seeking not just. I think they're seeking a way, not just freedom, but belonging. And it's very ironic in that South Korea, which is seen as this ultimate, ethnic Korean country, this bastion of Korean ethnic nationalism, that many North Korean defectors actually don't feel like they belong. And out of the people I've talked to, they found that America, the United States, is a much more accepting place for them, just based on its diversity and its values.
So that's a too fascinating a point not to dwell on for just a second there. Why is it this? Why would that be the case? As you mentioned, people would naturally assume that if a North Korean defector or someone from North Korea is looking to belong, is looking to fit in and assimilate, South Korea would be the easier option here. So what is it about South Korea, and what is it about the difference between North and South Korean life that makes America a much more attractive option, or in some cases a more attractive option?
Well, I think there are several factors. First, I think, just to give you a personal example, I'll keep these names anonymous, but my friend, I think, when he first resettled in South Korea, he was attending a regular South Korean high school, as opposed to, although he was several years older than his classmates, he actually faced a lot of discrimination if he said that his hometown was North Korea. So he had to feel like he had to hide his identity or hide who he really was. And not just that, but I think there are maybe two types of people in the North Korean defector community. One who really embrace their identity as coming from North Korea, and I know a lot of these are much more from an older crowd and are involved with more conservative leaning groups in South Korea who do the balloon launches and who are very involved with North Korean human rights advocacy. But the other I guess group of North Korean defectors in South Korea, their North Korean identity isn't something that they want as the primary aspect, the face of who they are. So, they just want to blend in and fit in, and sometimes, in order to do that, they undergo plastic surgery because that's what they see as part of South Korean culture in the media that they consume in North Korea. But no matter how hard they try to fit in, I think it's very difficult based on the language, just based on the culture, to fit in 100% into South Korean society. And go ahead.
So that's a very interesting point there, that despite being inside South Korea, in many ways they stand out more than they would in America. In America, they are a migrant, and America is a migrant society in many ways. But in South Korea, they through language, through accent, through behavior, through culture, through custom, in some ways they stand out as uniquely North Korean, and they I suppose they put a flag up for something that they don't want to put up. They have to plant their identity on their face here. But one of the things that you did mention earlier as well is, and this comes to that point just there, that the importance of community. So one of the things people will notice about North Korean defector communities or migrants in general, and of course this is a key to your work as well, is that search for belonging. Is that these communities do tend to band together, and they do tend to stay together. So take us there. What is it? Why is it that these communities are stuck together? Is it simply that they have families back in North Korea and that they see their home country as in need of humanitarian help? Or is it a broader issue of cultural belonging?
Well, I think I'll give two separate answers to that, which are related in one way. One, I think, is just based on it's just pure logistics. So all North Korean defectors, all people who've escaped from North Korea, as soon as they enter South Korea, after they've cleared the test, I guess, and they're proven to be not a spy, not a North Korean agent of any kind. They go through this resettlement training for several months at the Hanawon resettlement facility, at the Hanawon Center. And then they can apply to be, the South Korean government, the Ministry of Unification, helps them resettle, helps them find an apartment and a job. And it happens that many of the North Korean defectors are sent to live in the same neighborhood, at least in Seoul, or even in the same apartment units. And it's interesting that, there's actually this after-school academy in the outskirts of Seoul, actually, called Kunsem Academy. It's basically a hagwon, or after-school class for the children of North Korean defectors. But it's conveniently located because a lot of these children of North Korean defectors, they all live within walking distance and all attend, maybe not the same school, but in close proximity. So, and then the second aspect, yes, the cultural aspect of belonging is that, as I mentioned, although it's definitely not the case that all North Korean defectors get along and have this sense of affinity, I do remember, January of this year, it was late December, I went to this end-of-year party. My friend, I won't name his name, but he invited me to this North Korean defector 송년회, which is basically this end-of-year party, and they were singing these North Korean songs and dancing, and it was and I think I was the only one who wasn't born in North Korea who was there. But I could definitely see that it was a very, very close-knit community from the brief time I was there.
Now, you mentioned there a couple of times that you didn't want to bring up the names of people that you knew. Now, I don't want you to, of course, and it is important in many ways that North Korean defectors' names, or people that leave North Korea, their names are not particularly mentioned across the media. So that brings up a question here, and now I'm not sure how relative this is, but how does safety play into all of this? Because there have been incidents in South Korea where South Korean defectors have been paraded in front, North Korean defectors have been paraded in front of the media in South Korea, almost exploited in some ways. And this puts their families back in the North in a lot of danger. But there's also been situations of, as you mentioned, North Korean spies pretending to be defectors coming down to Hanawon. And after they get out into the community, if they do, there have been assassination attempts on very high profile defectors. So the issue inside America, is there also an attraction there simply because of the greater security? You're not going to have your name publicized as much. You're not going to become such an issue, and you're a much less threat from any sort of espionage.
If you put it that way, I haven't heard anyone from North Korea who have resettled in the United States saying that security was their number one reason in deciding to come to America. But I can certainly see how that may be a factor in them wanting to come to the States.
So let's push on. So South Korea, of course, plays very loud through all of this. It's hard to get it out of the crosshairs. But just before we come back to America and the very specific work that your organization does, there are a couple of other moments and a couple of other issues concerning South Korean migrants, North Korean migrants, that are very hard to ignore here. So let's go to Japan for a second here. And this is a fascinating sort of enclave. So there are some very large communities across the world of North Korean defectors. Of course, South Korea, America, and we will get to China just after this. But the place that Japan has in this is quite extraordinary. So take us through some of the history here, because it goes back to, as you mentioned, as you mentioned at the very start, the Korean War. And prior to the Korean War, the Japanese occupation, many Koreans were taken there. And when the division of the peninsula happened, many of them chose to willingly go back to North Korea rather than to South Korea.
So about the Koreans in the Korean minority in Japan, which until very recently was the largest minority group in Japan, recently overtaken by the Chinese. So there was almost 1 million ethnic Koreans in Japan. And it's a very interesting story. I think more people are aware of this now because of this best-selling novel, Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee. But actually, most Koreans, so Zainichi Koreans, which literally means resident of Japan, they were actually from the southern part of the peninsula. So it's a bit ironic that they're labeled now as North Koreans or Chosenjin. But they were coming from this agricultural society from the southern part of the peninsula. But what my research really focused on when I was in Japan was looking at these ethnic Korean schools, ranging from elementary schools, middle schools, high schools to there's one ethnic Korean university, Chosun Korea University, that's actually in Tokyo. But it was actually the Kim Il-sung government that sponsored these schools, sent them supplies, sent them textbooks, and actually there's still a steady trickle of funding that goes to these schools. While the Syngman-rhee government or the ROK government, I guess they were not as focused on building up the Korean sentiment and nationalism among this community.
And these schools are incredibly fascinating. For people out there listening, I encourage them to go online and have a look. These schools are almost, and these communities are almost like little North Korean enclaves inside Japan. So as we mentioned earlier, there's a strong sense of belonging, especially in communities that leave their host country, the idea that you don't want to leave behind your family and your culture and your tradition. But many of the people in many of the communities in Japan were born in Japan, and these young Japanese Koreans go into schools where they have pictures of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un across the walls. They're taught Juche philosophy, and so let's walk us through some of that for a second, because this is fascinating. Why does does the Japanese government just allow this because it's a freedom of expression issue? What is going on with these schools?
Yeah, it's quite haunting. I don't know if lucky is the right word, but I had the opportunity to actually visit several of these schools, and including the university in Tokyo. And you walk into one of the most advanced. This is a university in one of the most advanced, high-tech, open cities in the world. And as soon as you walk in, there's a giant DPRK, a North Korean flag, in the courtyard. And I remember the vice principal of the school taking me on the tour through the library. There's a whole section just on the Kim family. There were murals of again, the Kim family, and there were portraits of the Kim family in every classroom. So you might think that how is this possible? How has the North Korean regime managed to brainwash these people? But I know that I just remember talking to a graduate of this university, actually, who now works as a journalist for the North Korean affiliated organization, the Jochongyeon organization's newspaper. But he actually said that, he didn't attend the school, and his parents didn't attend the school because they supported this propaganda. It's much more of to find a sense of cultural belonging. So for a long time, Koreans were identified by their traditional Korean clothing, especially the female students. And because of the discrimination that Zainichi Koreans faced historically in Japan. So now it's interesting. I first found out about this issue because my friend in South Korea, who's a North Korean defector, told me, "Oh, you have to check out these schools. They're doing such an amazing job promoting our Korean heritage in Japan." And I just could not. It was such a puzzle to me, because here was my friend who's doing amazing work in South Korea, who has escaped from the North Korean regime, praising the school that openly promotes North Korean propaganda. But for the people who attend these schools, it's a much different story.
So your friend there, that is too fascinating to move on from again. Your friend there who mentioned that, I suppose in some ways it's hard to imagine, but in some ways you can see it as well in the sense that in a society like Japan, and when you're a smaller community, and as you mentioned, a small community that in some ways has been victimized, you may desperately try to hold on to your identity at all costs. Once you feel that it's under threat, then you hold on to it more and more and more. And I suppose I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of your friend there, but is he in some way saying that if they don't hold on to their language, if they don't hold on to their culture, even if it's North Korean language, even if it's North Korean culture, if they don't hold on to this, they will soon become Japanese? Is that the claim he's making, that at least they're holding on to something that is in some ways still Korean?
And the most important aspect, one of the most important aspects of that is language, the Korean language, which they don't use there's a very strict Korean only rule within the classroom, but outside the class, or outside the classroom, or when the teachers weren't looking, I remember talking to these students, and they speak Korean with a very heavy Japanese accent, and they were definitely much more comfortable speaking in Japanese with their friends and their family. And I do want to point out that with these schools, they're private institutions. That's why the Japanese government has a hard time, completely shutting them down. But they have decreased financial aid and ways of funding for these schools. But South Korea also has an organization for Koreans in Japan called Mindan. And they do have schools. I visited the school in Shinjuku in Tokyo, but it's mostly for temporary students from South Korea whose parents are either diplomats or businessmen. And, there's a stark difference in the background and in the families of the students at these quote unquote North Korean schools, the Chongnyeon schools, versus the South Korean sponsored schools.
Now this is the sort of topic I could stand for hours. It's too fascinating, but we should move on here. So let's touch on one last aspect of these defector and these I suppose broader Korean communities outside of North Korea before we come back to the American context here. And it's important to mention China. So China has an incredibly large population, where especially across that North Korean border. On the other side of it, you effectively have a Chinese population that are also very, very Korean in many ways. So this is also the way out of the country for Korean defectors. And from my understanding, and from when you listen to accounts of current defectors, often they get sometimes stuck in China, and they can't make it out of the country because they are illegal once there. But in some cases, they choose to stay in China even if they are illegal. So take us to the Chinese context and this border zone and Chinese Korean communities.
Yeah, especially in China, out of any other place, I think it's one of the most difficult countries to get accurate information, especially about numbers of who's there. But even before the Korean War, there's this. There were several ethnic Koreans who are called Joseonjok, who are in this Yanbian, Yeonbyeon autonomous region that the Chinese government designed. And as you know, the majority of North Korean people who escape from North Korea come through China. Many of the female defectors end up marrying Chinese men, and either they end up staying in China or coming to South Korea. But what's very interesting is that this leads to a division of several families as well. But what's interesting is that many of these Joseonjok ethnic Korean Chinese, there's a very big brain drain in this Yeonbyeon region because many of the younger people elect to come to either bigger cities in China or to cities in South Korea to study or to work.
And that step from China out, this is one of the things that does fascinate me, and I know people have mentioned this to me a lot as well, that it seems to be once a North Korean defector makes it into China, they are in many ways still on the border of their home country. They are close. But the next step, the defection to South Korea or onwards to America, is something that is, if they have been brought up in the ideology, which of course most of them have, this much greater step. This is a betrayal of the country in many ways. And if you're on the Chinese border, if you cross into China, you can bribe your way back in. It's considered a minor infraction. But once you defect to America or to South Korea, you've crossed a line that you can't really come back from, though there are occasionally some defectors that still do go back. So let's take us there. This further step outwards to America, and this feeling of, I guess it's a feeling of betrayal in many ways. How do defectors overcome this, and do they still wrestle with the guilt that they are being in some ways betraying their country, because this ideology is something they have been brought up on?
Right. I don't know if North Korean defectors, again, I would never want to speak completely on behalf of them, but from what I've heard, I think it's a very self-selecting group, because I think it's a very, very conscious decision that people have gone back and forth deliberating between on whether to cross the Yalu River or not, or to leave China or not, even more riskier. So I think maybe it's not really a sense of betraying their country and their government as so much as feeling badly about the family members and friends that they left behind in North Korea. And the same friend that I was mentioning earlier, who had to hide his identity in this South Korean high school in Jeollado, I remember him telling me, even though he wants there to be a unified Korea, he will always call North Korea is his hometown, and he really misses the sense of goyang, his friends, that no matter what the North Korean regime is or what it does, I think it'll never take away that sense of belonging, that sense of kinship that he felt in his hometown.
So let's bring this back to the direct work of Divided Families USA. I can only imagine the roller coaster ride that you must have been through in the past 2 years. And 2017 was a year of missile launches and brinksmanship and nuclear tests. And 2018 has been a dramatic thaw in the relationship, and dominated by the diplomacy of Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, really a personal one-on-one diplomacy. So how do you see the last couple of years as playing out? So I suppose there are an awful lot of questions to get in across this issue here, but your first impressions here and your feelings on how this is progressing.
Before I was involved with Divided Families USA, I actually came from a human rights background. At my university, I was involved with an organization called Think, There's Hope in North Korea. And Liberty in North Korea started at my university, Yale as well. So I come from this human rights advocacy background, and from this background, I was deeply, deeply skeptical of the North Korean regime, of course, but also of engagement and of negotiations, especially ones as hastily prepared or unprepared as the ones we might have seen recently. Now, recently, I've been trying to see the other side, partly because of the family reunions issue. So I think whatever happens, I just sincerely hope that the three governments could prioritize this issue, the family reunions issue, and not just see it as another political bargaining chip, but see it as a human issue that should be addressed, regardless of what else happens.
And that's a very important point that you just mentioned there, that there's a lot of people that are skeptical about the talks, and of course I am one of them, but one of the aspects of it, one of the things that make people skeptical is the fact that it's incredibly personal talks between two people. But right. I read through some of the work and some of the comments coming through from your organization that there is hope here, in as far as, because it is just two people, and it is in many, not just two people, but because it is dominated by these two individuals, they could make very quick proclamations that could very quickly come true. So Donald Trump, for example, after the last summit, simply announced that America was going to pause its military drills, and of course they stopped. And you mentioned that this offers hope for your organization as far as a simple declaration between both between both leaders that you would facilitate such reunifications of families, you could get this happening almost immediately, and it wouldn't have to wait for the broader process, the broader denuclearization to actually happen.
Yes, that's true. That's true. And, what's always in the back of my mind, even while doing this advocacy with Divided Families USA, is that, these 2-3 day reunions that we've seen at North and South Korea, they're not, or, I don't think they're the end all, this complete resolution of what, South Koreans love to say is this hun, this trauma, this pain, the suffering that's been caused after 7 decades of division and of isolation. What keeps me going, though, is that there are people like Mr. Min, who I mentioned earlier, who, for them, it would mean the world to them. It would mean the world to these individuals on our registry. So even though we know that this is not going to solve the entire problem and bring closure to all these families, we believe that it's worth trying.
And how possible is it to decouple this program of your organization from the broader talks of reunification? So there are, of course, this, of course, in many people's eyes would be a solution to the problem. Of course, it'd be one great big solution, but it is in many ways a long way down the line. So I have to assume that the idea of reunification, as I'm sure many Korean communities in America think this is quite a good thing or a positive, I have to assume that is something your organization might not be so focused on simply due to the possible long time scale of this.
Yes, but this is a very difficult issue, Jed, because I think for a lot of these families, it's their dying wish to know what happened to their loved ones or to be reunited with their family members. So, I don't know what to say.
No, yes. And I suppose as a couple of final points on this one, we should talk through some of the processes here. So what would your response be to people who are skeptical? So I read this in an article that you wrote yourself. You say that some pessimists say at this point that divided families are a sunk cost. Now, you go on to say why this is not the case. So I might get you just to explain that there, because many people listening might think, the North Korean issue is one of these intangibles, one of these things that you can't rely upon, and any agreement that we get is a challenge. So I might get you just to explain why that is a misguided, a wrong-headed approach to this.
Well, I would say my immediate response is that you have the prisoner of war remains issue, the repatriation issue, but these elderly citizens with family members in North Korea, they are the last remaining human link between the United States and North Korea. And just saying that means so much, because in just a few years, as you said, in less than a decade, once this whole generation of elderly people pass away, there's not going to be that link anymore. And that means so much. If you want to talk political, that means so much just for trust building and confidence building in terms of negotiations. And I'm sure that will help with any other issue like the nuclear issue between the U.S. and DPRK.
Which, of course, should bring us to I suppose, a final question here, and something I think will wrap this up quite well. And this, I guess, is also quite a personal issue for you. As you mentioned, your grandfather was from a previous, not defector, but someone who has a divided family inside North Korea. And you mentioned as well a couple of times that this is something that the children and the grandchildren of these generations can give back to these generations. And these generations remember something that people growing up in our era have and South Koreans growing up and Korean Americans have no real conception of. We talk about things like a unified peninsula. We talk about the horrors of the Korean War, but it is all just a history book to us. And looking back and advocating for the unification of these families, this is one of those ways. If there's a failure, which we hope there wouldn't be, it is a connection to history and something that the children and grandchildren of these generations can owe back to their grandparents and their parents.
Yeah, that's put very, very eloquently. And in the United States, there's been, if you look at the history of the United States and the values of the United States, there is such an emphasis on the importance, the priority of the union of family, the unity of family. And we've seen that at the U.S.-Mexico border in this, Reunite Our Families movement. And if you look at, the various topics that we've covered today, whether it's these elderly Korean American families in the United States, whether it's North Korean defectors who were separated in South Korea from their families in North Korea, or these overseas communities in Japan and China, what I really see as a line that connects, as a theme that connects these groups, is this division and pain, these separated families caused by the Korean War, but sustained by the North Korean regime, and sustained and hardened by these political fissures. So, if there's one takeaway that I want to leave with the audience and the listeners of this podcast, is just to remember that time is running out to overcome these divisions and to heal these wounds of separated families.
And I will put a link below this podcast to the website of Divided Families USA. But as Vice President, and through all we've spoken about today, I suppose is the last point we should finish on, is if people are listening, if people are interested, if people want to assist, or if people have family members and they haven't contacted you yet, but they are interested in your program, how can they assist? How can they reach out to you? And how should they go about this?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. It's very, very common, especially for Korean Americans, for a grandmother or grandfather to be from North Korea. And first off, we are always accepting registration forms for people who wish to participate in a face-to-face reunion program or in these technological video reunion programs. So please check out our website, Divided Families USA, and sign up there. But also, if you'd like to get involved, even not in the advocacy part of our organization, but just in this storytelling part and recording the histories of families part, you don't even have to contact the organization, but I urge anyone, especially in the younger generation who's listening, to speak to your grandmother or your grandfather or an elderly person who might have loved ones in North Korea, because you might not have the opportunity to before you know it.
And that is, I suppose, a good moment to end this podcast out on here. So as I mentioned before, I will provide links below this to the work of Divided Families USA, and I encourage listeners to go and assist and join in as they can. Paul Lee, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thanks so much, Jed.